All right, so Hypercerts are a tool to build scalable retrospective reward systems for impact. And what I really mean with that is what the goal is for the next, let's say, 20 minutes, so that you understand what I understand from this sentence, really. So the agenda is that I give a little intro, retrospective funding. We have heard a lot about that today already, but I will briefly say why we are actually excited about retrospective funding and what that has to do with Hypercerts. Then go into grant system, retrospective funding, and price competitions, all about like how can we use Hypercerts in these systems to get like a Hypercert funding system started, and then tell you a little bit about why we think that Hypercert is an interesting interoperable data layer for a lot of funding mechanisms and what the benefits of those are. So retrospective funding, why are we excited about it? Well, if we look at it from the perspective of the funders, it's actually much easier to fund something after you have observed the impact. When you have observed the impact, uncertainty has been resolved, and it is easier to allocate your limited resources to those things that actually were the most impactful things. That is especially important for nonlinear public goods. These are public goods where the impact doesn't just increase with the work or the activity that you do. An example is like half a bridge is not as half as good as a full bridge, and a retrospective funder would just not fund half a bridge. They would rather like look at those things that were actually impactful, where the bridge is finalized, the impact has been realized, and that's where they put their money. So it's easier for the retrospective funders, but at the same time, they actually create powerful incentives for the contributors, for those who create the impact. And that is because when you fund it retrospectively, you can make sure that you actually increase the rewards as the impact increases. So we have an increasing function of rewards in the impact. That is, while you actually produce some public good that is supposed to be impactful, at every point you have now to ask yourself, how can I maximize the impact that I create, and not just follow whatever you wrote in a grants proposal 6 months ago, but you can ask yourself, and you can pivot, and you can maximize that impact, and afterwards you will actually get rewarded for that. Ideally, and we think that definitely will happen, that it also attracts more talent, because now more talent means you actually get rewarded more for the impact that you create. So we get more talent working on the most impactful projects and public goods that we see. And the third benefit why we think that Hypercerts or retrospective funding is exciting is because it creates a way to create recurring income streams. Recurring income streams, basically just the idea that as long as you actually create impact and an evaluator can prove or like shows that you create impact, then you can also turn that into income and have a sustainable financing model for your public goods project. What does that have to do with Hypercerts? Well, Hypercerts are something like carbon credits on any impact vector. So we can think of it on like biodiversity, journalism, or for open source funding. And carbon credits is not a perfect system, as we kind of probably all know, and currently there are a lot of efforts to make this better. But what we really want to do with this is have this object that really identifies the work that we expect to be impactful. So we make this work identifiable, traceable, and transferable. And that allows us, especially in the retrospective funding, to really implement these mechanisms and also explore and experiment with these mechanisms where we have a common primitive of Hypercerts. Hypercert can look something like this. That's kind of the front of the Hypercert, but it's important that we have two parts here. So we have the part of the Hypercert, and then we have the part of the evaluation. So as I said, the Hypercert really accounts for the actions that are expected to be impactful, and that means we just identify who did what when, what does the work like point to and want to have an impact on, in what time frame, and what are the rights that the owners of the Hypercert have. And then, in addition to that, we have the evaluations that can be self-evaluations and independent evaluations that can be quantitative or qualitative, and they really point towards the Hypercerts. And with that we take that into like 2 objects, we make it more flexible, build a more open system where we can develop the evaluations further and work with all these projects that work on impact evaluators to plug into the Hypercerts ecosystem. This is not all just theory, but we actually have built a pilot application that is available on hypercerts.xyz, and it creates kind of this Hypercert, and currently it's running on the Gurley testnet. We have implemented the ERC standard 3525 because a lot of the things that create really impact are the things where people work together, they collaborate, they find other projects, teams that work on something similar, and in total they really create more impact than each individual contributor could on its own. So the standard allows, for example, sharing a Hypercert between 3 contributors with different shares for each of them, because they might have not all contributed to the public good in the same way. Or we can actually also share it with like 50 smaller contributions and 1 major contribution. So this is like what this EIP standard allows us to do. So now I'm switching gears a little bit and talk about like what does that actually mean? How can we really apply that? And how can we take the first steps into implementing Hypercerts into systems where we basically like create the first Hypercerts and get it out in the world. So grant system is basically like the simplest thing. And attaching kind of Hypercerts to a grant process would be just like a Hypercert is minted, evaluated, and then funding flows, and the grantee who receives the funding actually awards the Hypercert then to the grant maker. This is not a big change, except that we now have like a public record of this funding, and we can see it. But the exciting things about like this system is when like multiple grant makers actually use the same system, because then it becomes really easy for a second grant maker to just also buy parts of the Hypercert and fund the contributor through the same system. And then we can also think of another funder that is a retrospective funder to actually do the same thing, but now after the public good has been created. So we can combine multiple funders and also retrospective funder with others in the same system, and make this system easier to like have transactions in. So we lower the transaction costs, which will be very beneficial if this happens on like a very large scale. That is where the benefits get really realized. Also, when we think about multiple funders, then we also have benefits when the evaluation is actually done very publicly, that evaluators signal to the funders, to different funders, and every funder can rely on the signal instead of just doing their own primary research. So that is kind of where we think this open system of evaluations and funders, prospective funders, retrospective funders, is something where each player, each role can be optimized in itself. And that really will improve the whole system, because it's not that we construct the whole system from like designing a Hypercert system, but we try to create an open ecosystem where every player optimizes their own role in it. When we think about a lot of funders, we can also think about like crowdfunding. So when we think about crowdfunding, think of combining Hypercerts with Gitcoin. So every funder actually gets a Hypercert to prove what they have funded in the past. This is something that is now that Gitcoin moves to the open grants protocol. So we can basically build a module for the grants protocol that every round can, in addition to all the functionality from Gitcoin, also issue Hypercerts to the funders. And to make that more concrete, let's suppose we run a retrospective funding round on Gitcoin for the most impactful Web3 open source software in 2022, or a subcategory of that with like the most impactful solutions for decentralized social media. And the interesting thing is, like, if we not only do that once, but if we do that regularly every like 6 months or every year, then we really create this powerful incentives for people to go out there and start projects because they know there will be funding in the future through these mechanisms. Something where this becomes very concrete is also price competitions. So price competitions, when we think about retrospective funding in itself, this is like the simplest sequence for retrospective funding. And the question is, of course, again, why would anybody start to create this public good in the first place? And it is because we need like strong signals about future retrospective funding. So, and these expectations need to be reliable. And the easiest way, and this is the way that is done with price competitions already today, is you announce a price, you really specify what are the criteria to give out money in the future. Then with hypercerts, combining that with hypercerts, would be that hypercerts would be minted and accepted to the competition. Based on this acceptance, they optionally can raise initial funds from other funders. The public good is created, it is evaluated, and then the retrospective funding flows to the contributors who actually did either the best work or met the criteria that were specified. So this is also just like a small departure from how price competitions work today. What we are excited about, if this really happens on the same system with a lot of different price competitions, and then if we have those price competitions with specific criteria, we can also think about a second step where you don't actually like specify exactly what you're looking for. You're opening up the solution space even further, and you announce funding for a specific impact vector. Basically, you say, like, every 6 months, I will buy hypercerts in the evaluation education space, and if I want to start something in education, I can basically look at the process, how funding is awarded in this sector, and make sure that something that I do will be that impactful that it's recognized by these funders that award funding regularly in these impact markets, impact vectors. And then if we have a lot of funders doing exactly that, then retrospective funding can emerge as a norm, that is just normal. Nobody actually needs to announce anything anymore, but we all kind of look back who did like the best, the most impactful work in a specific area, and we fund that. And the funders actually have like reputation, prestige that they get from the hypercerts. So basically, like hypercerts as kind of the new Rolex that you show to others. Like you want to signal that you have done something with the opportunities that you have, and hypercerts is kind of the way you can do that. And to make that a little bit more specific, I would actually ask Vincent on stage, because Vincent from VidaDAO is working on a project on a price competition, and they are currently thinking about doing that with hypercerts. Vincent.
Perfect, yeah. So maybe for like the very brief backstory of kind of like how this happened. So we kind of, with VidaDAO, are funding longevity, and kind of like one of our ideas was like to do public goods experiments, and we did like a Gitcoin quadratic donation round where we put in money, and also Vitalik, I think, put in 400,000. And actually, I think like the longevity prize was just a project we're keen to explore, and like I uploaded it to Gitcoin, and ultimately I think it ended up being like the second or third highest funded Gitcoin project in the round, with like 8,000 donors, and received 200,000, then another 100,000 from donors. So then we had to do something with it. So and basically the idea was always to explore native crypto mechanism design for novel price mechanisms, and we were like in early chats with crowdfunded cures, kind of like exploring retroactive public goods and kind of like new price mechanisms. And yeah, so that kind of like then led us to exploring also this exploration in the direction of hypercerts. So maybe like to go back for the kind of like different stages. So the first one is really on just getting like crowdfunding the retro prize pool, and like we're having a starting point with like the money we already got. But basically, people can donate basically onto the prize and receive Hypercerts later in exchange from the prospective funders. And then the prospective funders basically buys Hypercerts from researchers who are participating in the prize. And the goal is to distribute those prizes on a yearly basis, so the prospective funder have some certainty that they have like some financial payoff. Yeah, so kind of like also repeating kind of like the graphic there. The core is really to create like a novel incentive and also upside for a prospective funder to come in and fund research that might be public good medicine and like it doesn't have like a financial payoff. And the retrospective prize, of course, rewards that and pays for that. And the concrete project that we're working out together with Sava and Cash from Crowdfunding Cures and Longevity Prize, VitaDAO and everyone else involved, is kind of like exploring a novel mechanism with Hypercerts to enable public good medicine by concretely repurposing generic drugs. So kind of like there are a bunch of drugs out there like used for like, for example, like rapamycin or metformin that have like lifespan expanding and like health span expanding properties also in humans, but that are off patent, and so there's no incentive for anyone to do clinical trials. And the goal is basically to explore this as one of the probably lowest cost and fastest ways to improve longevity. Yeah, so the goal is basically to start this like this year, like as a very small proof of concept and pilot. And I think the benefit is really like only when we really like build like a first pilot do we see like the edge cases and what we need to figure out. I think like the first impact markets and impact certificate ideas were already floated 5 or 6 years ago, and I haven't seen really like an implementation that showed some of like the things that might break also in a small pilot. So yeah, the goal is basically to in this concrete example to have like a basically get like researchers listed that are doing research and with generic drugs and repurposing them for longevity with these kind of like endpoints. And the goal is like to launch this with like 150,000 kind of like by the end of this year, and then to raise kind of like the prize pool to say like 1 or 10 million and more, which I think is where it gets more interesting. But I think the goal with the first 150,000 would be that like we would distribute that funding in the first year. So even if there's like 3 or 5 research projects participating with clinical trials, they would have like a certain payoff, like some of them at least. Yeah, so the criteria is that we're still working out in detail, but is basically having like actual clinical trials, which are way cheaper for off-patent generic drugs because the safety profiles are already established. They already did basically have clinical trials in humans, so humans are already taking them since 50 years in some cases. So the only thing basically there is, for example, this example could be rapamycin, like a very like famous drug, combined with exercise compared to a placebo, and seeing how that improves some endpoints, like for example, 30-second chair test or grip test. Yeah, but that's basically the goal for the pilot. And if you want to get involved, like feel free to ping me at vincent@vitadao.com. And the goal is really to like work out the details, of course, also together with Hypercerts and Crowdfunding Cures and others, and see this through in a first small pilot, and also get like first people to buy the Hypercerts. And I think the benefit is really that with VitaDAO we have an impact DAO funding longevity research that has actually a treasury and funding, but also like 8,000 people in the community that are somewhat crypto native and into longevity. So we can actually like end to end have like the prospective funders within our community, or the DAO itself could fund research. And with the longevity prize, we also have the prize pool. So yeah, I think that will make it easier to get off the ground. But then I think it will be interesting to once it scales up and gets more hypercerts and researchers onboarded.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Vincent. Yes, I take that. And I think it's really cool to see that projects that were probably started around the time that we were thinking about hypercerts as well are now thinking about how can we actually combine that with hypercerts? How can hypercerts create value for such projects? And that is also something that we want to do more. If you have projects where you think hypercerts would be an interesting mechanism to use, get in touch with us, or if you want to know how it is working out with the longevity price, get in touch with Vince and me as well. So basically, just to conclude, what do we actually mean with creating an interoperable data layer with hypercerts? It is really this data layer where we think that different types of funding, and I explained already a little bit how grants and retrospective funding work together with hypercerts, but it is an interesting way that hypercerts is the connecting data between that so that grants and retrospective funding can actually operate also together. And that is interesting because retrospective funding is not a solution to everything. We still need, in some cases, grants, especially when when it's difficult to observe the impact, and we just rather fund the activities that a team does. Then a grant system might be just much easier. So there are different conditions under which different types of funding are actually applicable and the most optimal. And then hypercerts is also enables potentially more experimentation with different decision mechanisms, how we actually distribute the funding. And that doesn't matter in what types of funding. There are always the decision mechanisms that we use. And I think there are many more than the four that are listed here. And using hypercerts enables us to compare these and then later on, if you have retrospective evaluation of that, and see really what kind of decision-making mechanisms led to the most impactful projects being funded. And that is something that is, I think, something where we can improve the system over time more and more to arrive really at the best impact funding mechanisms or the whole tool set that we need to fund impact, and also to know under what conditions we will use what tool. So this is how the funding mechanisms live on the hypercerts. So the hypercerts is kind of this kind of simple object that we want to create, but it enables a lot of benefits according to retrospective funding. There's a lot of actors involved that can plug into the system through hypercerts, and that is really what our goal is to enable that. And that's why we think that hypercerts really are a tool to build scalable retrospective reward systems for impact. And if you are interested more in what we do in the project, go to hypercerts.xyz, join our Telegram group. There's also the first community call where we actually will show 8 different, or at least 8 different projects that kind of are thinking about using hypercerts. They will show what they are thinking about. And I think that is a great place to also find synergies with other projects or how they think about using hypercerts. And then we are in general just excited about your projects. So if you are thinking about something related to hypercerts, write us at hypercerts@protocol.ai, or just join the Telegram group and write it there so that everybody else can also benefit from your ideas. And I think I have a little bit of time for questions, and also Vincent is also still here, so if you have questions for Vincent, also ask those. And otherwise, I think I'm also the only thing that is between me, between you and the cocktail hour. Except Ben might be in between as well.
I guess okay, I thought the cocktail hour has already started, and so microphone is off. Awesome, I'm a huge fan of this, so it's really exciting to see all of this coming together. My question is, I didn't see it mentioned. I know it's been in the back of my mind, and I'm sure it's been on the back of your minds as well. But do you foresee the hypercerts themselves being used as kind of these, having long-term monetary value as assets? Use cases like carbon assets carbon credits are traded, and you can retire them, but you can also hoard them and hope that they go up in value. In the case of carbon, the market is distorted, so it's kind of questionable whether it will have a value or not. But in general, you could set it up so that the market kind of understands, okay, there will be a liquid market in the benefits that are being generated by this public good, and we will use these hypercerts to basically meter the allocation of the rewards for that. Is that kind of part of how the protocol has been, or the smart contract is being designed, and what are the kind of consequences of that?
Yeah. So I think there's a huge design space around hypercerts. Like what we are really focusing on is building this protocol as really identifying the work in itself, and then combining these with different funding mechanisms in the first place. So that is something that we are focusing on right now, and in the Hypercert protocol itself, nothing that you described is built in. Where this develops into is, I think, an open question where we don't want to set the primitives such that it excludes a lot of options, but it is something where, and that is, I think, why I'm introducing this as trying to build a primitive for an open ecosystem around hypercerts, that a lot of things are possible, but we are not trying to build in too many things in order to self-optimize the system over time.
I want to share a perspective also as a disclaimer. I helped a little in this, but something that gets me crazy excited about hypercerts is this idea of retrospective funding. What you know from carbon markets, for example, you could today create a startup that knows we can create carbon credits cheaper, 10x or whatever, than the market, and we know somebody will buy them. And if we transfer this principle to basically any kind of public goods market, I know if I find an innovative way of building a lot of schools, or drill wells, or quality adjusted life years, or whatever, suddenly we can use a lot of the mechanisms that work in startups and apply them to public goods. So I can take risks, I can be innovative, I can assemble a team, hire top talent, lend money somewhere, because I know I will be able to sell the impact. So I get over this goal confusion of my organization has to somehow make money and somehow also create impact, because I'm literally selling the impact. And just wanted to share that because it gets me super excited.
Yes, thank you for that perspective. Also, other comments also welcome. It doesn't have to be a question.
Cool. So basically, like I mentioned, that on the hypercerts there's the impact score. So how is the methodology basically made visible, accessible?
I probably sound very evasive for those questions, but it's again building an open ecosystem also around the evaluation. And we have heard a lot of talks about impact evaluators, the different methodology. It can be quantitative, it can be qualitative. I think there's a lot of work that there's no project that can do all of that, and that's why we focus on building this primitive around really making this work identifiable in the first place, and then trying to have, and Raphael is actually one of them, who's talking about and thinking about very sophisticated ways of evaluating impact. And then if we can plug hypercerts into that system and make it really easy for the evaluation to report on a hypercert, then I think that is kind of what success looks for us, because then different projects can try to have different evaluations, and we can even think about what happens when different evaluations on the same thing actually produce different results. And then you have more things where I mean it's something about the impact space today as well, that there are not a lot of negative evaluations of impact, and change. I don't want to just have have a list of like these projects wasted your money, but it is something where like a lot of money is wasted today. And if we build in systems that basically say this is where you really spend your money most effectively, then you get a system overall that that produces over time much better results, but it only will do that if you allow for different evaluation systems to also compete with each other, and then we just have to make sure that the competition is not for who like where's like the most positive evaluation, but like also something around like where is the credibility created in the system, who do we trust to evaluate, and all of that probably stems back from the retrospective funders, because like especially when you have large retrospective funders who say, this is actually what I want to fund, and these are kind of the evaluators that I trust, and that is then a system where like the retrospective funder and the role is extremely important in shaping the incentives for the contributors, but also for the evaluators themselves.
Can I expand on that?
Sure.
Awesome. Thank you.
I mean, I'm out of time, but go ahead.
Yeah. Cocktails, whatever. So just to emphasize that the problem of figuring out what constitutes impact, it's, you know, there's no right or wrong answer, but there is convergence, right? You can get incrementally better, and you can figure out how much better you get it, right? And that's at the heart of, you know, it's a little bit sophisticated from the mathematical perspective, but it's actually really simple. It's about finding better models that people can agree on and getting better at agreeing on these, right? So to the extent that these can be quantified and you can look at the performance of these models over time, you eventually don't need anymore to rely on any one specific impact evaluator, but you can just trust the network that whichever evaluator you point to, it's going to be consistent with the other ones because you're working off of the same reality, right? That's ultimately it.
Cool. And now we are actually out of time, but thank you for that. And I hope we will continue the conversation outside, but I think that's Ben's announcement to make. No? Should I open the cocktail hour?
No, you should not.
Okay.
But I'll join you.
Yes.
Let's give Holko a round of applause.